Good morning, everybody. My name is Steve Miles, and welcome to our CES webinar on certified natural gas, the future of LNG. We have a 1-hour webinar with 4 very exciting panelists, so I want to get us started right away. Start by sharing my screen. And if I can, there we go. Okay. So let's first do a level set to bring everybody up to the same speed. What is certified natural gas? Well, it's natural gas that is independently determined. I think we're probably going to talk a lot about that. Using some stated criteria, sometimes objective and sometimes subjective, and we'll probably talk about that too, in order to satisfy one or more of the so-called ESG components, that is environmental, social, and governance, but typically including reduced methane emissions, which will be a key part of our discussion today. And if you're not certain about this term, well, or goes by any other name, there are a number of terms that are used for certified gas, also responsibly sourced natural gas, differentiated gas, that gets to something we'll talk about today as well, or reduced carbon, lower carbon natural gas. Why is this an issue now? Why is it coming up? Well, this is probably not a surprise to a lot of folks, and I think some of our speakers may touch on it as well. We certainly have ESG demands of consumers and LNG buyers. Consumers certainly in the United States, domestically, in Europe domestically, and LNG buyers. We've seen some at least reported resistance, certainly in 2020, to US LNG on reported environmental grounds having to do with carbon flaring, methane, fracking. So we'll talk about whether that is changing with certified natural gas or differentiated natural gas. Access to capital is vitally important, both on the equity side and on the lender side. You see there a couple examples of groups, the Principles for Responsible Investment, 3,100 signatories, $110 trillion in assets under management. They're looking at ESG as a criterion for investment. And of course, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, also a very large group, very large assets, and that's the lender community, the finance community, and they're obviously also taking ESG very seriously. And then of course, regulators, policymakers. A number of states have limitations on carbon or mandates for purchasing cleaner fuels. There are pending EPA methane regulations that were adopted under the Obama administration, rescinded largely under the Trump administration, and now are purportedly under review again. In the European Union, they proposed methane roadmap in 2020, the EU recovery plan, the value of carbon credits on the market, and carbon border adjustment proposals all help to drive interest in lower carbon and lower methane, particularly natural gas and LNG. The global methane pledge announced by a number of countries, including the United States and the European Union and others, just a little over a month ago, in which those countries promised to lower their methane emissions and to source natural gas responsibly. And of course, as we all know, upcoming, the COP26 in Glasgow will certainly have some impact on all this, although we don't know quite what that is, and we'll probably talk about that some during the Q&A. Big slide, but just to give you a feel for it, just some of the recent headlines in the last few months. These are all from North America, but you'll see these but similar stories elsewhere, just to give us a flavor of how many places are talking the talk about wanting certified natural gas or to produce responsibly sourced gas. And it's an open question whether all of these entities are walking the walk to the same degree, and that's something we're going to check. So this is a document, Washington Gas online, and I just couldn't help but notice the last sentence on the last page of their fact sheet about certified natural gas. And if we have someone from the audience from Washington Gas, please, I encourage you to chime in the Q&A section. There's nothing wrong with this last sentence, but I think that it brings to the forefront the issue. After talking about how great certified natural gas is and how they want to have, move to a certified natural gas procurement, they add this sentence: procurement of certified gas will require approval by the public service commissions that oversee Washington Gas's customers' rates. I think what that means is this is going to cost more, and it has to get approved first. And so we'll be chatting a little bit about that. And of course, in the international sphere, will LNG buyers be willing to reward or at least compensate or provide greater access to their markets for US LNG exporters if in fact they've gone through the effort, the cost, the initiative to obtain certification of their upstream and midstream links in their LNG value chain? So we got a bunch of good questions. I've already touched on some of them. These are a few more, and I'm going to, at the end, open this up for questions and answers, questions from the audience. Please feel free to use your Q&A box for that. I will certainly be putting forward some of these questions as well to our panelists. But let's move on and get started. In brief, we have 4 fantastic panelists really representing 4 different quadrants of what's going on here. We have Matt Watson, Vice President for Energy Transition, Environmental Defense Fund. I'll do a little bit of bios on everybody in a moment. Then Christopher Smith, Senior Vice President of Policy at Cheniere, one of the leaders in the LNG space and working on reduced methane and cleaner fuels. Catherine Hillis, Program Coordinator of Equitable Origin, talk about their ranking system, particularly on methane, but she might touch on the S&G elements as well. And Will Jordan, Executive Vice President, General Counsel, EQT Corporation, again, one of the leaders in really driving towards cleaner fuels, lower methane as part of an upstream production. So let's get started with Matt Watson. In addition to being Vice President of EDF's Energy Transition Program, he leads their global methane work. He communicates, liaises with professionals in North America, Europe, China, Asia Pacific. He also acts as a primary contact for key stakeholders in government. Before joining EDF in 2009, Matt worked in a variety of roles in state and local government in Texas. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a master's degree from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. Matt?
Thanks, Steve. And I want to thank the Baker Institute for hosting this conversation. At EDF, we really appreciate the practical, real-world focus that the Institute brings to both its research and to convenings like this. We've done a couple of them with you guys. I also want to thank the co-panelists who really do represent some of the most committed actors in this space. And what I'd like to do today is a couple of things. First, I want to highlight what we see as the potential value that emerging gas certification schemes can bring to the larger project of reducing oil and gas methane. And the second thing is to tee up some of the challenges we think will need to be resolved for these efforts to be a success. I'll note that my comments around differentiated gas are really just going to pertain to methane performance. I'm not speaking to the full range of ESG considerations that some of the certification schemes take into account. The other thing I ought to do is be clear about EDF's priorities so you understand where my biases lie. Our view is that voluntary commitments, private contracts are never really going to be an adequate substitute for robust enforceable regulation. But that's not to say they're not important. And that's why we've devoted so much time to working with the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative and the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership to encourage companies to set strong emission targets and to build accountability through rigorous MRV. In fact, if all of the OGCI companies and all of their non-operated joint ventures met the targets that OGCI has set for itself, about half of the world's oil and gas production would be on track to make something like a 75% reduction in methane emissions by 2030, which of course is what the climate modeling says is necessary to meet the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. But still, that's only half. And so that's why we're focused on getting strong rules in place in countries and in regions that have reliable regulatory capacity. The other important piece of this is getting methane performance standards in place in the major importing regions of the world, so Asia, Europe, to help drive reductions in parts of the world where that regulatory capacity isn't as strong. And when we talk about import standards, what we're really talking about there is differentiated gas, just at a more comprehensive scale than what we're seeing or are likely to see through voluntary gas certification programs. So really, import standards and gas certification schemes are flip sides of the same coin. It's just that on the latter, market participants are seeking a premium for low emission gas, and on the former, low emission gas is really more of a prerequisite for market aspect, at least or market access, at least in some respects. That said, even though we don't think gas certification programs can ever really reach the scale that will drive globally significant reductions, we do like the fact that there's so much happening in this space. In the first instance, it's just a demonstration of growing demand for a cleaner product, and that's a good thing. Perhaps more importantly, though, the serious players in this space, and I count the people on this panel among them, can play some really important roles in several respects. So demonstrating what reliable MRV looks like, validating best systems of emission reduction as detection and measurement technologies and practices improve, modeling what's needed in third-party auditing, building out the platforms for tracking and trading shipments and certificates, and through price formation, experience with price formation, building a record that we think could probably help inform policymakers as countries move to adopt import standards. So, in short, we see gas certification schemes when they're well done, they can effectively serve as pilot projects for import standards, which is ultimately where we need to go over the next few years. And in the meantime, if there's a buck to be made through private contracts and discrete cargoes, then by all means, more power to the first movers who are making it happen. So turning to some of the tricky issues, the most fundamental challenge to the integrity and credibility of differentiated gas is, and this is whether we're talking about gas certification or import standards, it's about ensuring that the emissions data is accurate, transparent. So we know that emissions factors, desktop calculations, really aren't reliable and generally undercount emissions. We know from several years of study that the US greenhouse gas inventory underreports emissions by at least 60%. And unfortunately, there are way too many gas certification regimes out there that rely solely on emissions factors and equipment counts, these desktop calculations that really don't have empirical backing. But a lot's changed on the detection and measurement technology front in the last few years, and this really doesn't have to be the case. With continuous or near continuous monitoring commercially available and broadly cost-effective, there's really no excuse for not verifying emissions through direct measurement, both top-down site-level measurements and bottom-up source-level measurements reconciled against each other, which seems to be a strong approach for getting a firm handle on what's happening at a particular site or across a number of sites. Of course, there's no one-size-fits-all technology solution. So one of the areas where we think gas certification programs can really help advance the bigger picture is by helping demonstrate which technologies and what statistical methodologies work best under various conditions. The second tricky area to think about is supply sourcing and the problem of cherry picking. So producers know which of their well sites are tight and well maintained and which ones aren't. And if certification entities and buyers allow operators to pick their best stuff and ship those cargoes and call them green, there's essentially no emissions benefit to the atmosphere. there's no reason to believe that the supplier is operating any better than its competitors, and therefore, there's no real market incentive or market signal that could drive improve performance more broadly. It's kind of snake oil. The sensible solution to that would be for certification agencies to measure methane intensity from a supplier as an average emission rate from all of the producers' operations within a region, a basin probably, which I know is the approach that at least a few of the players are pursuing. And there's also a convenience or an efficiency here, and that this approach would be consistent with how producers report, producers and midstream operators report emissions under the EPA greenhouse gas reporting rule. The last area I'll mention is the auditing of MRV programs, which is essentially the certification process itself. Currently, there's no standardized approach, a wide variation in metrics and methodologies and auditor independence. It's kind of the Wild West right now, which is to be expected in the early days. But I was thinking about it last night, and I was wondering who's going to be the BlackBerry and the Trio, and who's going to be the iPhone in all of this. But that said, as you have some folks out there that aren't doing it very well, I wonder how much reputational damage could be done to the more rigorous efforts and actors as others are promoting more slipshod programs. And this is something I would think folks on this panel would want to tackle head on. I know it's hard to call out your peers. We deal with that same dynamic in the environmental NGO space. But as we've seen with gas, just generally as a resource, it's the low performers who often shape public perception. And this is a space where there's real risk that everyone could get painted with a broad brush of greenwashing. I also wonder, as gas certificate trading platforms start to emerge, how they'll reconcile differences in the quality of one certified shipment as compared to another. And certainly as import standards start to take hold, governments and big buyers are going to demand a standardized approach to MRV auditing for both compliance with regulatory objectives, meeting their policy objectives, but also so that these things will be functional across jurisdictions. So this is an area that we also think leaders in this space can help or can play an important role by really helping to build out what these standards should look like and coalescing around an approach that rewards high performers, with the North Star always being accuracy and transparency, which are, of course, the prerequisites to credibility. I'll note here that we're pretty bullish on the OGMP 2.0 framework for measurement and reporting, and feel like there's enough momentum around it with major players that it could end up as one of the primary arbiters and platforms in this space. And I guess the last thing I'll mention is that as you move forward, we would encourage you to think carefully about the stakeholder ecosystem. So governments, industry, investors, major consumer groups, civil society, and in particular, as a critical part of that stakeholder ecosystem, we want to encourage you to consider and engage environmental justice communities who are rightfully suspicious of any pollution reduction regime that looks like it could benefit some and not others. So, Steve, I think that's it for me, and I can turn it back to you.
Thanks, Matt. There's a lot there to think about and respond to. But before I introduce Chris, I'm just going to take moderator's prerogative and ask you just one of about 5 questions I wrote down.
All right.
If we go with a system-wide as opposed to, or let's say a corporate-wide, as opposed to a particular, allowing companies to, as you said, cherry pick a particular field.
Yeah.
How do you account for the fact they have fields they're not operators of and fields that they are operators of? They might have a 10% interest. Do you look at that just nationally or internationally? Do you lump their Nigeria, Algeria, Russian, US assets together, Canadian assets together?
Yeah. So what I was trying to suggest there is and this is this is one of those things that people need to work on, right? But the idea I was trying to suggest there is that one way of doing it that could work is you would take an average of an operator's assets within a particular basin, right? So that within a basin, they're not just able to pick the newest, best, cleanest, tightest stuff, right? And make a premium on that, while really not doing anything to improve their overall performance. Taking that average allows you, presumably that creates an incentive to improve overall company performance within the basin. But I don't think you'd want to go broader than probably the basin level, right? Because operating conditions are so different from basin to basin, right? That it just wouldn't make sense. And I suspect that as import standards start, I mean, who knows what they're going to look like, right? But I suspect as import standards start to emerge, it looks like Europe is going to go first, that they would probably it would make sense for them to take an approach like that, as opposed to saying, okay, gas out of the US is X, right? It's too big to be, it's too big and diverse to be meaningful, right? So I suspect that basin level may be the way this plays out.
By operator and within that by basin.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's
there's probably other ways to do it. By the way, that's I know probably a lot of folks on this call paid attention to the methane fee legislation that's sitting there in the reconciliation package. As Senator Whitehouse originally wrote that bill, it was very different, right? It was that kind of approach. It was a basin level approach that then had some mechanisms to incentivize an increasing use of direct measurement over time.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Matt. And we'll get back to some questions, I'm sure, at the end. Let's move on to our next speaker. We're really fortunate to have Chris Smith with us, Senior Vice President for Policy, Government, and Public Affairs at Cheniere. Of course, Cheniere, the first LNG exporter from the outside of Alaska in North America. And Chris was Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy at the United States Department of Energy, where he led the department's policy and international engagement research programs. He has also been the designated federal official on the National Commission for the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling. Previously, he's worked at Chevron, Texaco. He was an officer in the U.S. Army with tours in Korea and Hawaii. Bachelor's degree in engineering management from the United States Military Academy at West Point, and an MBA from Cambridge University. Chris.
Thanks so much, Stephen, for that kind introduction, and also to the Baker Institute for hosting this important panel. So no slide deck for me here today. I'm just going to go through a couple of comments and hopefully get us to the question and answer portion, which I think is the most interesting part of these engagements. It was actually really interesting hearing some of Matt's comments, and also, we didn't really coordinate the sequence of these discussions or know the details, but there's actually a lot to kind of build upon in some of the things that Matt mentioned. I'll kind of start with, we're kind of the flip side of Matt's observation about the role and responsibilities of regulators and governments to make sure that they set the rules in a way that benefits society. And as a former government official, as a former regulator, that's something that I certainly kind of understand and agree with, right, in terms of that important role of good, prudent, common sense regulations that lead us in the right direction. Now, currently, as working for a private company, we're on the kind of flip side of that consideration. So what we're doing here is, we know that the rules are going to come, the playing field's changing. As a company, we can manage risks, we understand risks. I think we've got great people who understand how to build a business in environments that are changing. So we understand risks. As a company that deploys capital, we also like stability. We like understanding what those risks look like. And the interesting thing about this moment is that by its very nature, the playing field is changing, and it's going to continue to change. The goalposts are going to continue to move. And that's an environment in which we have to constantly adapt and think about what are going to be the business drivers of the future. And many of those business drivers fit around this area of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, making sure that your business models are going to be consistent with a much lower carbon economy of the future. So I'll talk really briefly about a few things that we're working on here at Cheniere. Again, in this environment in which there's an incredible amount of uncertainty around even what immediate legislation is going to look like. Rulemaking processes in Europe. We expect Europe to move more quickly than the United States in many aspects. And the need to put transparency and good data into the hands of policymakers so that we can make good decisions. So we're working on a couple things here at Cheniere that I'll talk about. I'll talk very briefly about our LCA, our life cycle analysis modeling. I'll talk about our QMRV project, quantify, monitor, report, and verify, and a little bit about something we call cargo tags, which is essentially sort of an Energy Star program for LNG, where we're trying to provide a greater deal of a greater level of detail and transparency to our customers so they can better understand their footprint in terms of what they're consuming. First with the LCA, with the life cycle analysis. So over the last couple of years, we've kind of built some of our modeling and data capabilities, building upon an open source model that came out of NETL, the National Energy Technology Laboratory, that looks at quantifying the broader value chain emissions for our product that we sell, which is liquefied natural gas. Our base business model is we buy natural gas from sources throughout the United States, from Canada down to Louisiana, from Colorado to Pennsylvania. We bring it to two sites in the Gulf of Mexico, one in Texas and one in Louisiana. We take that natural gas and we turn it into LNG, and we ship it around the world. So that's our business model. We're a full source provider of LNG. So we buy the gas, we transport it, we move it. We have long-term pipeline capacity, and we can either deliver it to your doorstep or you can buy LNG at our terminals. So that's how our business model looks. The LCA model, what we did in that effort was we took some modeling that had been done already and put some greater specificity to it, put better data into it, enhanced the NETL model, which is again a public open source model. And the effort is to provide a better, more detailed, more granular, more accurate look at what our life cycle emissions look like for CO2 and for methane. There's a couple of benefits of this approach. First, it helps us understand, where are the areas where we need to focus. So it helps us understand, what are the levers that we can manage, and where should we be putting our efforts. And the second is it gets a better degree of confidence and transparency to policymakers and to our customers, so to the broader stakeholders. A step that we took, which was unusual, was that we took this modeling that we did and the report that we generated, and we submitted it for academic peer review. And so it was actually a paper that was published in the Journal for the American Chemical Society. So, as some of you in this audience will be aware of that process that you go through when you're putting a paper forward for academic peer review, you lose control of it at that point. You get lots of input, and that's actually exactly what we wanted in this process. Because any third party is going to say, well, Cheniere says this about their profile, and we want it to be more about what our modeling looks like. We wanted that verification and that robustness that comes from that third party view, having third parties look at your work. So that's the effort that we did around that LCA model. An important outcome was it shows that the footprint of the product that we sell, LNG coming out of our terminals, is actually lower than the previously estimated from other studies, both previous NETL studies and other third-party studies that has looked at natural gas life cycle emissions. The second thing I'll mention is a second effort that we're undergoing, which is our QMRV effort: quantify, monitor, report, verify. So in that effort, we are the biggest buyer of physical volumes of natural gas in the United States. We buy from basins across the U.S. And in this effort, it's a 6-month effort with 5 of our most important suppliers. looking at multiple basins and 100 different point sources. And we're looking at a number of different technologies to try to understand what is the best, most effective, most cost-effective way of identifying fugitive methane emissions, particularly with a focus on finding and eliminating super emitters, which are an important part of fugitive methane emissions. So we're looking at various technologies, and we're technology agnostic. So we're looking at ground-based technologies. We're looking at drone-based technologies. We're piloting aerial technologies, both from helicopters and planes. We're piloting satellite technology. I guess probably about a month and a half ago, I was at an EQT site, which is one of our partners in this effort. And we had all of the technicians out taking readings at that site in Pennsylvania there on one day. So you had the ground-based effort, you had the drones flying overhead, we had helicopter flyovers, you had satellites overhead that you couldn't see, but they were up there, all at the same time. And what that's going to do is allow us to have multiple overlapping data on single sources, so we can do a real comparison about the fidelity of the data, how effective is it, how consistent are the different sources that we're getting, that will allow us to have some conclusions around how these sites really performing. So to Matt's point a moment ago, you can only really control and improve those things that you can effectively measure. And so we're going to come out of this effort with, I think, some better ideas about how exactly to do that. Also some insights on performance, but I think the important thing we're going to get out of this is a way of saying, well, here's cost-effective ways of identifying and eliminating fugitive methane emissions. And that's going to be something that's going to be of use to policymakers, but importantly, of use to companies like Cheniere and of our suppliers. And the last thing I'll mention is our tags program. So all the efforts that we're putting into quantifying what our footprint looks like, we're going to have a certification that goes into each of our cargoes that we're going to be providing to our customers, and so that our customers will be able to understand, I'm buying this cargo of LNG from Cheniere, from Sabine Pass, or from Corpus Christi. It's traveled to my location. Here is what the emissions footprint of that particular cargo looks like. And that in turn will allow them to think about, well, what are the steps that they need to take, or how do they manage their footprint. And they can only manage the footprint effectively if they understand the content of the energy that they're bringing in from their suppliers. In our case, Cheniere, since we'll be selling that LNG to that customer. So perhaps with that, I'll pause with those three efforts: LCA, QMRV, quantify, monitor, report, and verify, and then the cargo tags, all around data and transparency in an effort to try to bring more insight to the policy discussion and help policymakers make informed decisions.
Thank you, Christopher. I really appreciate that. Just a really quick question, if I can, about the cargo tags. When do you anticipate that beginning, if you haven't started it yet? And how logistically will you build it into the bill of lading? Will it be an independent document you'll produce? And just to be clear to everybody, this is not some buying credits for afforestation somewhere. This is an actual statement about what the cargo value is of the methane that's on the ship.
Yeah. So we expect that
content is of the LNG on the ship.
Yeah. So we expect that to be starting in 2022. It's going to be information that we would be communicating directly to the buyer. So it would be a transaction between Cheniere and our customers, and so that would be the nature of that disclosure. And there's still some details to work out in terms of exactly kind of how that handoff occurs. But the idea is that it's a one-for-one piece of information specific to a particular cargo that helps our customers understand what their footprint looks like.
It's very, very helpful with transparency and accountability. Thank you very much. Let's move on to our third speaker, Catherine Hillis. And Catherine is the program coordinator and supports all activity related to the EO 100 certification program, which she will describe to us, I'm sure. She has a master's in international affairs from University of California at San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. focus on environmental governance, and a BA from the University of Oklahoma in economics. And did I read also in Chinese?
Yes, yeah. That's one.
Okay, we're that's very impressive. 3 years in the oil and gas industry at Phillips 66, and she has published research and energy policy on natural gas in Guyana with the Institute of the Americas. Catherine.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen. I'm really happy to be a part of this panel today and hear from the rest of you that are raising some really great points. I'll share some slides and briefly go over a bit what our program looks like and how we go about answering some of the great questions that have already been raised by this panel that we think about a lot and really undergird our program and why we think it's so important. And so first, just a bit about what Equitable Origin is. We are a nonprofit that's based here in the US with the mission to partner with business communities and the government to support responsible energy development. And we created the first voluntary stakeholder-based standard for responsible energy development all the way back in 2012, modeled on a lot of what we've seen in other industries and with certification like the Forest Stewardship Council. So we're really glad the oil and gas industry is catching on to certification and growing in this way. We've been at it for a while. This first site was certified in Colombia in 2014. And we're just excited to see that it's just now taking off in North America within the past few years. And to address a bit of the comments that Matt and Chris brought up, we do a project level implementation. So looking at a site or basin level, all well pads within an area. The site is certified and our process is all about focused on stakeholder engagement, engaging with the community as well as some of the environmental aspects. And so as I mentioned, we have the standard for responsible energy development, which was the standard we first created that can be applied to any type of energy development, oil and gas, renewables, et cetera. And then within that, we have specific technical supplements that relate to a specific type of energy development. So for certified natural gas, we have the natural gas technical supplement that's focused currently on upstream from production all the way up to processing, which is very important as that's can be a huge part of LNG cargo emissions. We're currently in the process of updating this technical supplement. We have regular update periods to keep pace with the best practices of the industry. And I will get more specific around quantification methods on GHG, making sure that emissions are accurate and not just solely based on vague emissions factors. Then we also have 5 principles that cover the full scope of ESG. So we're focusing a lot on methane on this panel, but we also look into the social aspects, governance aspects, in addition to climate change, biodiversity and environment, which has a focus not just on methane and GHG, but also land, water, et cetera. And so within these, we have different objectives, which are the topics that I just mentioned. And then within those objectives, there are various performance targets, which are the actual best practices and standards that a company would be assessed against. These are at 3 different levels. So, and this is just to encourage continuous improvement so that the companies in our program are always striving to be better, meet higher targets. And so performance target level 1, we see as meeting industry best practices. Performance target level 2 would be exceeding those. And then to get performance target level 3s, you'd really be a leader in the industry. And this is all determined through independent assurance. We have assessors or auditors that are separate from us, third parties that go out into the field, talk to stakeholders, look at company documents to verify that they really are meeting all these practices. And we see that as a really important step to avoid conflicts of interest. We're the standard setter, but we aren't the ones assessing against the standard. And this also gives companies the assurance that the claims they have in their ESG reports are valid and verified by a third party, not just something they're saying internally, to add that transparency that this industry and this topic is really desperately needing. And so after that assessment process, a company could be EO certified if they meet our targets. Just to give a very brief overview of how the process works. So we work with a producer to determine the site or basin area that they're certifying. They complete a self-assessment against all of our targets where they start to gather documents, seeing how they meet each target. And this can be used as a gap analysis to really see where they are, if they're ready for this, et cetera. Then the independent assessor would go out, do the document review again, interview stakeholders, and ultimately visit all the sites on the ground. And any targets that they aren't fully meeting yet would then go into a continuous improvement program where the producer would create a plan on how they're going to meet those targets, when they're going to meet them. And the assessor goes out annually and does another smaller review of how they are progressing along the way and meeting those. And a certification is good for 3 years. So then at the end of the 3-year cycle, they go through that full process again. And we think this is really important, and that voluntary standards really do matter, especially in a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected, and as regulations are always changing and uncertain, as Chris mentioned, to create a universal standard that all companies can use, and as a way for investors and shareholders and just community members to understand what's happening with these companies on these really important topics. So I'll pause there and make sure we have time for questions at the end, but thank you for this time.
Thank you, Catherine. And it's really impressive how Equitable Origin is tackling the entire ESG rubric. It's there's so much there that you could get into. I suppose there's some risk of sort of addressing so many issues on so many levels at the same time. On methane specifically, and not that the others aren't very important as well, but on methane, are you all developing your own system of measurement and quantification, or are you cooperating with another group that is doing that?
Yes, so we are, as I mentioned, we're developing our technical supplement. So we are kind of working through that and what methodologies. We do partner with MIQ right now on a lot of certifications. Companies can be EO and MIQ certified, which is another nonprofit that dives just deep specifically into methane. And so we find that that's a really good partnership for companies to get a broader ESG scope with us and then dive deeply into methane, especially as buyers downstream, as we see just on this panel, are hyper concerned about that as well.
Concerned about everything. Thank you very much, Catherine. To save time for questions, let's move on to our fourth speaker. We're really fortunate. We have Will Jordan, who is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel for EQT Corporation, truly one of the leaders in this space. And we've heard a couple of our speakers mention EQT's work so far, and we'll add some there as well. Let him add some there as well. Prior to his current position, he served as a Senior Vice President, General Counsel, Corporate Secretary at Rice Energy, and Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary at Rice Midstream. He spent 8 years at Vincent & Elkins, a fantastic firm, and he has a Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics from Davidson College and his JD from the Duke University School of Law. Will.
Thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen. Thanks for having me talk to you all today. I think a lot of this has already been hit on, and so I'm going to try to sprint through and really talk about, at least as we're looking at optimizing which is the best natural gas in America. I think we also need to take a step back and talk about the global perspective a little bit. And in an EQT's opinion, we see a significant opportunity for reducing global emissions on both a carbon and methane standpoint through increased use of U.S. natural gas. As you look at the charts on the left, you'll see that 75% of emissions by 2050 are going to come from non-OECD countries, primarily China. And I think, while I don't think this event is something that we need to rethink the whole addressing climate change process, I do think that the current crises in Europe and Asia are showing us that when we're talking about a sustainable pathway to a low carbon future, we're going to have to look at energy optimization as opposed to energy elimination. And in that world, when you're looking at optimization, you need to look at countries and companies and say their roles in this overall grand path may be different. For America, I think we need to understand, one, that we're one of the few countries in the world that has energy abundance. and two, that we have some of the lowest cost and lowest emissions intensive gas in the world. And if you say, if you accept that, and we need to keep testing, and that's one of the reasons why EQT pushes so hard. But if you can get to that point where you accept that, then the answer is we need to be investing more in natural gas and more in natural gas infrastructure to allow us to achieve our goals. And just contextualize that, I give this example, we gave this in our ESG presentation back in June. If you looked at China alone, and only China's new build coal-fired power plants, and you replace those, so none of the old ones, just the new planned ones, you replace those with natural gas fired generation, you'd save 370 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. That's roughly equivalent to 9 times the world's carbon capture, and it's roughly equivalent to the impact of the entire US renewable sector. So, okay, the next question is, what does it mean on methane? I'm working on that. I've actually had some emails with Matt on this. At least the numbers that I'm seeing right now, if you used average US gas, it'd be methane neutral. If you used Appalachian natural gas, it'd be a 10%, 90% reduction, a 10% less methane. I need to dig into those numbers. I think that's directional, but I think people don't realize that coal is actually a major emitter of methane. So, you know, I think I portray that as kind of an opportunity to accelerate if we invest in natural gas and invest in infrastructure and LNG. I think the current crises in Europe and Asia show the problem with only focusing on elimination, either in reducing CapEx and traditional energy sources, or establishing higher standards. You know, Matt mentioned the kind of import standards being, you know, maybe they look in the United States and look basin by basin. You know, my view is that that'd be great. Appalachia would do really well. However, we'd have to have more pipeline, because as you're reducing the amount of supply coming from other sources, you get what we have going on in Asia and China and Europe right now, which is they got to a point where the balance between supply and demand was so tight, and it actually broke. And now there's an undersupply. And the reason for the run up in pricing is there's nothing to quench that supply, and prices have to go up to the point where instead of switching between coal or gas or oil, it's now just eliminating demand. It's pricing out steel production, it's pricing out fertilizer production. And I don't think that's really the path that is a sustainable path in the long term for us to get to our goals. You know, and so in my opinion, how can America play a role in this? You know, there's really only 2 major exportable power source materials. You can export oil, and oil can be used, but it's not a huge power driver. It's coal and natural gas. You know, the United States represents almost a quarter of the world's natural gas production. It represents about a 1/5 of the world's LNG. And so, you know, if you think, well, if we don't develop our natural gas, maybe it'll come from elsewhere. And the answer is it's not really true. There's not an abundance of natural gas plays across the entire world. And importantly, and this is where I think responsibly sourced gas is something that's, you know, we've looked at it. I mean, yes, there is a profit potential, but the reason why we came out strong behind getting both or getting 2 different certifiers, including Equitable Origins, we're working through finalizing right now. It's the start of a conversation. It's the start of a conversation around what are the different emissions profiles, not only within America but in the world, and how do we optimize between those? You know, we came out because we think we're in a very enviable position. We have emissions intensity that's roughly half that of Russia. EQT is the country's largest producer of natural gas. If we were a country, we'd be the 12th largest country, and this is where we'd stand relative to those others. And that's before, in the next 3 years, we reduce our methane and our greenhouse gas emissions intensities by another, call it 70 or 65 and 70% respectively. EQT expects to be net zero by 2025, if not beforehand. And so, we see a huge opportunity for gas. We see that if we can educate and get to the point where people understand how valuable this resource is, not only can we use it to export and influence other countries. I mean, we import 89% of our solar panels. We need to have at least a global perspective on how to solve climate change, because we have to be able to use our resources and expand beyond just kind of our base area. So I have a few more slides, but I want to also get to questions, so I'm going to stop there.
Well, thank you, Will. That's very thoughtful, and I see there are some questions for the panel in the Q&A box, and I will get to those. Let me start off with one general question, something that you mentioned, Will, and then in terms of producers in the U.S., perhaps a different standard than some other places, and not just the U.S., I'm sure Canada as well, but compared to some other places, certainly other places perhaps aren't investing as much, and they may not have the flyover of planes and satellites and helicopters and to get the full monitoring that's available here. And so, is it a completely level playing field is, I guess, a question that I want to ask. And Catherine, I'd like to start with you if I can. At least one of the collaborators that you talked about on, with Equitable Origin on methane measurement has a very objective standard, right? They have an A through F, we're talking about. It's if you have this much methane, you get an A, you get this, you get a C. Do you all intend to have a similar objective standard, or will you measure different countries differently? Will you give a more subjective score? Will you grade on the curve, as it were, for a country in Africa that really has a difficult performance, but they're the first company to say, yes, we want to try, and you want to give them, you're going to give them a C instead of an F? Because Chris is trying to sell cargoes competing with them.
Yeah, so I definitely don't think we plan to alter our targets or standards to meet different countries. We are sensitive to different areas of operations and challenges, particularly when it comes to dealing with different stakeholders that may be more difficult. But this standard is meant to be applied universally and applied in its original form wherever it goes.
And Matt, that's your view as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if we're talking about what good looks like, then the climate can't afford for us to be grading on a curve. I think there are other ways to approach questions of differentiated responsibility and different levels of economic development, climate finance, technical support, that sort of thing. But we don't want to dumb down what we're, saying good looks like.
Right. Thank you, guys. Let me read a couple, unless somebody else wants to jump in on that. Let me read a couple of the questions from the audience. Here's one for Chris. Has it been removed? Chris, have you answered already?
Some of them might, because I actually typed a couple of answers.
Okay.
So
somebody asked a question. I don't see it here now. A thoughtful question, which was, what kind of response are you seeing, Chris, to your cargo tags, your overall program, but particularly the cargo tags among potential buyers in Europe and elsewhere? I mentioned in the beginning introduction some of the challenges, particularly in 2020, that U.S. exporters had. Now, of course, prices are so high, there's a lot of noise in the signal, so maybe it's hard to tell, but are you getting a positive reaction?
Yeah, so we're in an unprecedented moment in terms of prices, spot price in Europe and in Asia. So as you mentioned, there's a lot of noise in that movement. But the direction remains constant, that there's going to be a consistent, persistent drive to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for better transparency, for better information. So we've seen a lot of interest in this program. In fact, kind of more than maybe we had even anticipated, just because it gives so many stakeholders, from buyers through policymakers, a way of quantifying this challenge that they're facing. So a lot of issues that that Catherine raises, that Matthew raises in their discussions, come around to the need to actually understand the emissions content of the thing that you're managing and that you're regulating. And so by the efforts of marrying these technologies to measure, along with kind of better disclosure to your customers, it gives the customers a better understanding of what their profile looks like. So we've seen, I think, a lot of interest there. Again, it's an unusual market right now. So certainly at these prices, that's the thing that's driving. But we see the drivers over time being very consistent and increasing on climate pressures.
Good news. Thank you, Chris. We have a couple small sort of technical questions. Let me see if I can pound those out in the minutes that are left. There's a question for Will. When you say that increased U.S. natural gas production is aligned with remaining below 1.5 degrees Celsius, are you taking into account Scope 3 emissions?
I'm only talking about Scope 3 emissions. I mean, the example on China is that the combustion emissions from coal are going to be lower than the combustion emissions from natural gas. So yeah, when I say different companies in different countries are going to have different roles, yeah, America's net zero may go up, or its Scope 3 may go up, EQT's Scope 3 may go up, but the world's emissions go down. That's the point.
Chris, will Cheniere make its CT data available to the wider public, or will it be confidential?
Yeah, so initially that disclosure is going to be directly between Cheniere and the customer. So the broader modeling, we've made that public. So the paper and the model that we made around the life cycle analysis model that's the base for the tag is not only public, but that's been through a public peer review. The data that we're giving to the actual customer is a service to the customer. So that is something that would be a transaction directly with that client.
I understood. Subject to a confidentiality agreement, I assumed. I mean, doesn't the customer need it in order to be able to say to their downstream consumers, I've gone out and gotten you cleaner fuels?
Well, indeed, right. And in the past, that's been done through their own estimates or national engineering estimates for what emissions look like, et cetera. So there's always been a way of estimating these things. And what we're trying to do.
Once they do that, is it still confidential? I mean, I'm wondering whether it's not just going to leak into the public domain, whether it's going to pour into the public domain.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, we'll see how that actually operates once we're there. So I think what we're really focusing on right now is creating the right methodology, creating the right type of data, creating the right transparency in terms of what our method looks like. And it's our crystal ball is foggy in terms of how some of these things will fall out, because again, the standards are going to change. Expectations are going to continue to become more stringent.
Fair enough. I got one more question here, and then we'll see if there are any last ones from the audience. I think one of the things that's come through here in the discussion is that there are consequences. There are consequences to having good monitoring, MRVs. There are consequences to having bad ones, or sloppy ones, or ones that don't accurately and transparently recognize what the situation is. And then there are decisions that are made by those who are applying the MRVs. Is it field specific? Is it company specific? Is it site specific? Is it country specific? And all these will have economic consequences, because if we do this right, these certificates matter. right? We're talking about differentiated gas, differentiated LNG. Matt may want some command and control regulation, fully understandable, but we all recognize that a market premium probably helps move things along too. So my question is there an appeal process? If a standard setter, whether it's EO or it's MIQ or it's whoever it is, Joe's down the street, gives a letter grade or a number grade, is there any remedy if it just really wasn't done well?
I mean, maybe I could start with that. It's a hard question. So we're in a world right now where for the broader range of ESG issues, there isn't a single standard. And there's competing interests. I mean, we talked a little bit about environmental justice, some other things, like do you have some sort of sliding scale that it takes into account other issues. So, I mean, I think it's a topic for an entire session. But in short, our approach at least is to do our best with the data and the technologies we have to provide it in a way that's transparent. And overall, the drivers to get to substantial reductions are going to weed out approaches that over time aren't effective. Now, I say this with love for policymakers, as having been a policymaker, right? It will be a winding course, and it's tremendously difficult. But we're not in control of that. The best thing we can do is take the steps that we can with the piece of the value chain that we manage. And it's our hope that in the marketplace of good ideas, that better, more rigorous, substantiated, verified ideas will rise to the top. And those are the things that stakeholders will pay attention to.
To jump in real quick and echo something that Matt said earlier, I think, look, the complexity of what the right technology is and what's spitting out the right number, and whether you agree with the auditors or not, I think it highlights something that Matt mentioned earlier, which is we just need some uniformity. And I'll also echo the plug for OGMP, the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. I think their approach to frameworks and having it applied in a much more broad area is a way that can make it easier for buyers to say, if you achieve some level of level 4, level 5, which are the 2 gold standards under their process, you get your discount on the price of methane is smaller or something. I think that's kind of a simplistic view, but I agree with Matt on that approach.
Thank you, Will. Well, we are over time, and so I'm going to wrap it up here. But I just can't thank enough Matt Watson, Christopher Smith, Catherine Hillis, Will Gordon, not just for being here today, but for you and your institutions, your companies, all your organizations being leaders in this space, all in different pieces of it, different quadrants, but leaders in this space. And it's vital, it's important, and hope you don't mind my having asked some challenging questions, but you guys you're great, and thank you all for your efforts, and look forward to doing a 2.0 in the future.